buenas tardes. Vamos a dar inicio a este último panel. Mi nombre es Iván Rebolledo. Soy Managing Partner de Terra Nova Partners en Nueva York y presidente del directorio de Global Americans. Con el permiso de todos, voy a conducir este panel en inglés. La mayoría de nuestros integrantes me han pedido que lo hagamos en inglés. I want to thank Funglode and President Fernandez for his kind invitation to participate here today as moderator of this panel. I had the distinct pleasure of meeting President Fernandez many years ago within the framework of the Inter-American system, in his responsibility and engagement as chief of various OAS electoral observation missions. He had the kindness of inviting me to join his team. So thank you, President Fernandez. It's also a pleasure to see President Felipe Calderón of Mexico here with us today, and many other friends and distinguished participants. I'd like to make a few framing remarks, and then I will proceed to introduce our panelists who are here in person and those that will be joining us virtually. So this 9th Summit of the Americas, the relations among countries in our hemisphere are generally cordial, but often discordant. In recent years, facing an array of shared problems, governments have been unable to come together with a sense of common purpose. Over these past 2 years, our hemisphere faced a crucial test with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, which ravaged the Americas more than any other region. Clearly, this 9th Summit of the Americas offers an opportunity for hemispheric leaders to reinvigorate efforts to tackle a common agenda, which include rule of law, climate change, migration, education, health, economic and social recovery, and development. As my colleague Eduardo Gamarra said today over lunch, this may not be the moment for ambitious initiatives, but incremental progress that can and should be made through partnerships involving governments, the private sector, and civil society. With that said, I'm going to briefly introduce each of our panelists in the order that they will speak. First is Ken Frankel, to my immediate left, who is Ken is president of the Canadian Council for the Americas, a public and private good that convenes conversations on the significant issues and stakeholders from across the Americas. Since 2014, he has taught law as an adjunct professor of international commercial negotiations at Ghent University in Belgium. And previously, he was general counsel for a multinational company and legal advisor to the Secretary General of the OAS. He will be speaking to us today on Canada's search for a foreign policy and new global realities that could mean for Latin American policy and other observations in changing dynamics. To his left is Dr. Jane Chiquette, who is Emeritus Professor of Political Politics and of Diplomacy and World Affairs at Occidental College. She's a specialist in international relations and Latin America, having pursued her undergraduate degree in political science at Swarthmore and PhD in international relations at Cornell, writing her dissertation on politics of development in Peru. She has edited 7 books, published more than 50 articles on topics ranging from Peruvian politics to international feminism, with a special emphasis on women's movements and democratization in Latin America. Virtually, we have, she will focus on politics, participation of women, and the future of democracy in the Americas. Virtually, we have Guy Mantell, who's the Executive Director of Global Americans, a Western Hemisphere foreign policy think tank based in Washington. He writes and speaks extensively on U.S. Latin America and U.S. Caribbean relations, and frequently briefs congressional staff and other international observers about U.S. policy toward the region. Prior to joining Global Americans, Guy held multiple positions in the U.S. Senate, working primarily on Western Hemisphere policy, immigration, and judiciary issues. He will be speaking to us on U.S. Caribbean relations, obstacles and opportunities. And lastly, Anatoly Kudam, I'm sorry, I will not do well with his last name. Anatoly Kudam-Avek, who covers Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean for the New York Times, and he's based in Mexico City. Prior to moving to Mexico last year, he spent 8 years in Venezuela. He has 13 years of experience reporting on Latin American politics, economics, and society. He's a native of Russia and a graduate of the University of Edinburgh and University College London. He will be speaking to us on a timely issue, Latin American perspectives in the aftermath of the war in Ukraine. So without further ado, I will pass the mic over to our distinguished colleague, Kenneth Frankel, and we will ask each speaker to speak for approximately 10 to 12 minutes, and I will be ruthless with time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivan. Let me first start off by thanking President Fernandez honoring me with this invitation. I'd also like to just say that it's a thrill to be on the stage with Jane and share the same platform earlier in the day with Abe, both of whom I read while I was first studying Latin America in university, although you were just a very young academic at that point. And Jane's writing was very instrumental in helping me start to understand a bit about Latin America. So thank you very much, Jane. To start, to be a proper Canadian, I have to start off by apologizing for something. Canadians are good at apologizing. So let me just apologize to my good friend, President Calderon, for Canada having won the octagonal to qualify for the World Cup in Qatar. And we hope Mexico makes it, can join us there. I want to say a few things about Canada's role in the world in Latin America, and then I want to conclude with a few other observations gathered over the last year or two from the work we're doing at the Canadian Council for the Americas programs that we've been running. And I often, when I meet people and they want to talk about Canada and Latin America, there's always several things that they say. The first one is, we think Canada is a great country. It's a great example for all of us. And we would love to see more of Canada where we are. And why isn't there more of Canada there? And I think the tendency is, if you are coming at it from a U.S. perception of Latin America, and even more so, the United States' place in the world as a hegemon, or one of the two hegemons now, I suppose, or even if you're from Latin America, but your view of Latin America is sort of through the eyes of the hegemon or what the hegemon is doing, you tend to think that why can't Canada do that too? And the reality of it is Canada is going through its own, I wouldn't say crisis of confidence, but going through a grand reassessment of its foreign policy. And at the end of it, there may be clear indications of what it wants to do about its relations and activities in Latin America. So we've obviously reached so many game-changing moments over the last several years that it seems that might be the world we're living in now, that game-changing events are happening constantly. And given this reality, as I mentioned, Canada, like I imagine every other country is doing at this point, is reassessing its entire foreign policy. And this is particularly so for Canada for two primary reasons. The first one is Canada has relied far too long on an outdated notion of its place in the world. It has flirted with espejismo, we could say. It has not re-envisioned, energized, or prioritized its resources in a coherent way with respect to its foreign policy for a long time. And I'm talking about administrations of both conservative government and liberal government. And if you need any indication of the priority that Canada has placed on foreign policy, it's had 6 foreign ministers in the last 5 years. Elections come and go in Canada, and foreign policy is never mentioned, which I know might sound very strange to a lot of people who have visions of the heyday of Canadian peacekeepers and engagement, even during the Central American wars, the ushering or helping to usher in democracy during the early 90s, et cetera, et cetera. But the facts speak for what they are. With some exceptions, such as its current leadership of a multilateral group to work out a solution and challenges at the WTO, Canada, as I mentioned, has not put any sustained energy, and it has not gone through an institutional review of its foreign policy, which is a very Canadian kind of a thing. It used to happen with a bit of frequency. It's a rigorous exercise, but it's an exercise that's necessary every number of years nonetheless. It hasn't done that since 1995. And if you think about what's gone on since 1995 to the present, you know a few things have changed. And therefore, as you might surmise, Canadian foreign policy and a grand vision of what Canadian policy should be, what Canadians' interests should be, a coherent global vision just has been lacking. It has paid attention to Latin America, as folks here know, spasmodically over the last number of years, previously, as I mentioned earlier, but it's been more rhetorical than action-oriented, and it has decided that it was going to rely just on the fact that it has extensive web of trade treaties with practically every single country in Latin America, either bilaterally or multilaterally. So what are these premises of Canadian foreign policy that are being shaken or have been shaken since '95, but particularly in the last several years? Well, Canadian foreign policy has been based essentially, I've put them into 5 categories. One might come up with a few extra, one might combine them. But the beliefs that Canada's had about itself is that it's a middle power by dint of its economic development and key contributions in important international economic and military moments, and the power of its relatively successful social compact and the maintenance of a very vibrant liberal democracy. The second fundamental I would point out is the middle power status gives Canada influence and flexibility to take leadership positions with like-minded countries to shape international issues. And it enables Canada to be a key interlocutor in important international moments. That's the third, I'll say, illusion or perception that Canadians have about what its foreign policy is, that what's essential is a rules-based global order. The order is grounded, and here I'm quoting from former Foreign Minister Chrystia Freeland only a few years ago, territorial integrity, human rights, democracy, respect for the rule of law, and the aspiration to free and fair trade. Another pillar is multilateralism, and alliances being critical for a middle power in order to have influence in the world. And of course, there's the very multifaceted and very complex relationship that it has with its southern neighbor, with which it shares the longest unprotected border in the world. Particularly, it's important for Canadians' relationship with the U.S. with respect to economics and security and winter vacations to the Caribbean. And so you can see when I outline these fundamentals, you can see how wobbly they are. These foundations of all those five that I mentioned are very, very shaky. Under current conditions, soft power, which Canadians pride themselves on, with certainly in the past with some good reason, and the power of example may be useful as a middle power, but having significant military resources is critical for having significant impact. It's one of the lessons we're learning very clearly right now. Canada has underfunded its military for some time, but I can tell you in the upcoming budget, that is going to change. Canada has learned its lesson, and it's seeing what's going on now in terms of Ukraine, for example, but that's not the only example. So the question I would ask rhetorically was, when was the last time Canada played a significant role as an international interlocutor? Its peacekeeping role, which it earned, is essentially during the Cold War as being an interlocutor for flashpoints between the United States and Russia, where it could go into certain areas and sort of smooth it over. Those conditions don't exist anymore. And clearly, no one's looking to Canada to be interlocutor in those kinds of situations. Canada's lost its attempt to get on the Security Council. It lost its bid to get on the Security Council the last two times it's applied. So I know that's not many people's perception of Canada, but in fact, those are the real facts, and those are facts that Canada has to go through with a reckoning. There's one event that happened recently which reverberated in Canada, which has changed the thinking of Canada, forced Canada to start thinking about its position in the world. And I just want to run this with you quickly, but it's the case of the two Michaels. It's known as the case of the two Michaels. And what happened on an extradition request from the United States several years ago, Canada arrested the chief financial officer of Huawei, a large Chinese telecom company that everybody here has certainly heard of, and there's been a lot about it in their activities and bid for expanding its activities in Latin America, Brazil being just one of them. Canada arrested, they had to, under a legal obligation, they arrested this officer. She was given due process. She was allowed out, could stay at her house, could travel wherever she wanted. The only condition was that she stay in Canada. China retaliated by arresting two Canadian civilians in China, kept them in a cell, often solitary confinement, with the light on 24 hours a day for over 1,000 days. Okay, and they were, and the pretext is that they were spies, which was ridiculous. And in fact, we'll go through how they were finally released. They were finally released when the United States decided to drop its extradition request. But this sense of hostage diplomacy by China, and the fact that Canada found itself rather defenseless, and the fact that China would even try and do this, had a huge impact on Canadian thinking and where it stood in the world, thinking that this wouldn't have happened earlier. I'm probably running short on time, right? Yeah. So let me that's the pretext. Let me skip very, very quickly, if would, is how might the Canada rethinking of its foreign policy played out? It's hard to know because Canada is just going through this exercise now. Soon it will put out its position, its Indo-Pacific strategy, and we'll find out in clues from that what the government wants to do. But if I were to predict, or if the Canadian government would ask me what it should do, I would stress that obviously has to continue its multilateral efforts. It's going to continue to do that with respect to liberal democracy, continue to be a vocal critic about what's going on in Venezuela and Nicaragua. It's going to be very active, as it has been under Prime Minister Trudeau, in looking for multilateral support for environment and climate change. And one other place that will be looking for more help, which has been a cornerstone for the Trudeau government, is a feminist foreign policy. Feminist foreign policy, the way it's been translated or interpreted or implemented by the Trudeau government, is to essentially orient its entire foreign aid programs to helping empower, providing opportunities, elevating the status of, et cetera, of women. And so Canada will be looking for help with that and looking for right partners. Another thing Canada needs to do, and I'm sure this will come as welcome news to many people here, it clearly needs to beef up its bilateralism. In short, it needs to make friends again, and it needs to have conversations, and the kinds of conversations that lead to friendship and good working relationships. I would also make a point, in talking about the private sector, that with the disturbances going on and the political uncertainty in Euro-Asia as well, large Canadian money, and Canada has some of the biggest investors in the world in Latin America. Some of them, and I think even more, are going to start to look at Latin America again. If Latin America produces the kinds of infrastructure projects that are to scale and the kind that warrant the kind of Canadian investment that Canadians have traditionally made in Latin America. So that's a bit of a bright future. I think also there's discussions to be had with Canada and the hemisphere about the three things that Canada clearly is a leader of: food and food security, energy, and minerals. And I don't think, and one speaker today didn't fail to mention those three elements. Canada is a world leader in that, and there are interesting conversations to be had to see how complementary relationships can be made with Latin American countries. I'll skip Canada and finish on just one. I want to finish on one observation about Latin America. I'd like to have, maybe we can come back to others. I spend a lot of time in Colombia, and things we can talk about Colombia and what's going on there. But there's one I do want to talk about, is in the work that we've done at the Council, I would say that the program, one of the programs that's drawn most interest, hundreds and maybe thousands of views, was a program we did with the incoming economic team of President Boric of Chile. Part of it, I suppose, was to allay the fears of some big money about the incognito of what the President Boric was going to do with investments, but that really wasn't the purpose of it. The purpose of it was the people he brought into his cabinet have done serious study of the modelo nórdico, the Nordic model, and are serious about seeing what aspects of the Nordic model they can integrate into the Chilean economy. And I know this sounds to a lot of people, how do you see Sweden in the same frame or Norway as Chile? But the fact of the matter is, these folks have put out a book only several months ago and have come up with some pretty interesting conversations. I'm not a Canadian, I'm not an economist, and as a Canadian, I'm not going to skate on thin ice on this one. But one of the issues that they point out, which has been echoed by Mariano Mazzucato at the London School of Economics, who, for my mind, is one of the influential economic thinkers now in political economy, is, and I know that people may not want to hear this, but the importance of the state in developing business and development and economic development in a country. And their studies show, by the three Scandinavian countries that they studied, that none of it could have happened without a strong vision from the government, strong funding by the government, and a prioritizing by the government. Mariano Mazzucato complements that in some of her writing about talking about the same thing with respect to the United States. And the idea that the best thing for the government to do is to get out of the way and the markets take care of themselves, she says is complete nonsense. And the example she uses a lot is the NASA space program and all that it's produced, and biotech and tech. The idea being, and I will finish here, that it's to get the kind of economic development with social development, it requires significant visionary, bold, audacious funding and activity by the government. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Dr. Jaquette, please.
I'm very happy to be here to thank President Fernandez and Funglode and their equipo for making it possible for me to be part of this group and to participate in these conversations. My topic is women and democracy in the future, but I want to spend a little bit of time going back to the past. I couldn't be in the Dominican Republic without recognizing the important role of Minerva Bernardino, who was along with a Brazilian woman, Berta Luz, was one of the main forces getting women and men into the preamble of the UN Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, a Dominican woman, against the opposition of the Americans and the British, who thought talking about women in this context would be vulgar and they shouldn't do it at all. So congratulations to the Dominican women who were behind this and to the Commission on the Status of Women, which she was involved in. Since then, things didn't improve that rapidly, one might say, for women. And I first began working on this topic in the 1970s. Both Marisa Navarro, whose name you may know if you study women at all, from Argentina, and I, who'd only spent a year in Peru doing my research, from very different experiences, argued that Latin American women would not likely take on feminism, would not likely adopt feminism. My reviews on this were reinforced by my experience in 1975 at the first UN meeting on women in Mexico City, where Latin American women were completely, is that me doing this? I apologize. We're very opposed to North American feminists, arguing that the problem was not patriarchy, the problem was imperialism, and the issues were economic and not cultural. So it reinforced my view that Latin American women were not really ready for taking on feminist causes. But I was wrong, and Marisa was wrong. And one key reason why we were wrong is the turn from military authoritarian regimes to democracy in Brazil and the Southern Cone in the 1980s. Women also responded very importantly in a way I want to pick up at the end to the impact of structural adjustment programs by coming together, putting together communal kitchens, providing social services of all sorts, and providing essentially the social safety net that was never compensated, was always very much part of providing their social capital and their human capital to this cause. The movement for democracy really mobilized women, not only in the Southern Cone but elsewhere, led to a series of encuentros of feminist women throughout the region over the next 20 years, connected women across national boundaries in ways that have been documented by other people. The phrase democracy in the state and in the home, which was a Chilean invention, became an important call to action for women and led to a lot of demands for women's political representation in these new democracies. So, return to democracies. They weren't new in the historical sense, of course, but in these newly reformed democracies. The demand was that for a parity cabinet, I think, was first implemented by Michelle Bachelet in 2006. They are now the case in 14 countries, including Canada, but also Peru and Bolivia. Of course, this changes from year to year as cabinets change. For a few years, several South American countries were headed by women: Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and Costa Rica at the same time. But this has not become a pattern, and it may not, may never see it again. However, it's very important to note, I think, that in the region today, the countries with the highest female representation in Congress are Cuba, Bolivia, Mexico, Nicaragua, and Argentina. Only 4 countries have received 50% female representation in either upper or lower chambers of their assemblies: Cuba, Bolivia, Rwanda, and the United Arab Emirates. You might note that none of these countries are standouts as liberal democracies, and so it tells you something about the use of female representation as a form of manipulation. I believe, in fact, if I remember something about history, I think in the Dominican Republic, Trujillo appointed female provincial governors in order to control them, to control the situation. I'm always struck with the fact that it was President Fujimori of Peru who was a big public fan of feminism, went, I think, the only president of a country that went actually to the UN meetings in Beijing in 1995, the famous Beijing conference, at the same time while he was promoting a policy of sterilization of indigenous women in Peru. So there's a patina use of female representation to try to burnish your international image problem that may explain why. It's these countries that have the highest representation, but it's window dressing. It's not true representation. Arguments for representation are very strong, however. They are symbolic. Equity, role models, women becoming more involved in all aspects of their society, and they're substantive. The idea that women would bring different values to politics and different priorities. There's some indication that women's greater representation is associated with more generous social policies, but generalizations are dangerous. Women are not a voting bloc. They're not a monolith. They tend to agree on social welfare issues, but not on policies that have to do with abortion and family law, for example. It is striking that in Chile, which I was just talking about as being ahead in terms of several aspects of feminist representation, divorce was not legal until 2004. So there's not a direct connection between democracy, women's progressive legislation. In Latin America, as in the United States, all these progressive changes have been backed by social movements. And social movements are not easy to sustain. So legislation on these topics has varied dramatically from country by country. Abortion is an interesting case. Nicaragua and Honduras have some of the most restrictive abortion laws in the world, while Argentina, Colombia, and Mexico have recently legalized abortion. And ironically, given the confidence that US women had in Mexico City in 1975 when they went to the first UN meeting, 2 years after the Supreme Court legalized abortion under the Roe v. Wade decision, today that Supreme Court is about to overturn Roe versus Wade, which will leave abortion policies up to each of the states, many of which have already passed very restrictive legislation, including Missouri, where abortion is only permitted to save the life of the mother. Only permitted to save the life of the mother. So there's an immense amount of variation on abortion issues in the United States and, in fact, in Latin America. Some important lessons can be drawn from these observations. First, women's representation cannot be understood simply by the numbers, by the data. Women's overrepresentation may be one indicator of rule by an illiberal regime or party, which is using it to polish their so-called democratic image internationally. Second, and this is important, women are not a bloc. They can participate on both sides of deeply polarized politics. And they have done so in the United States and are doing so in places like Brazil, for example. The abortion issue in the United States is a good example. Legislation is always subject to backlash, and often with the participation of women very actively. The recent recognition of abortion rights in Argentina, Colombia, and Mexico could easily be reversed as a result of this. It took 50 years to build this backlash in the United States, but it is about to succeed in overturning Roe versus Wade. And those rights that women have counted on in the United States for 50 years will be lost. You'll have to go to some particular state where you can find access to abortion, assuming that that can be allowed to last. Similar divisions exist in Latin America, with Catholic and evangelical groups opposed to women's rights to choose. Any assumed linkage, which we sort of thought back in the 1980s, between democracy and progressive politics on women's issues cannot be relied on. That connection cannot be relied on. Third, issues about women's reproductive rights, like issues of gay marriage or transgender rights, have challenged those who see class or race as the key issues dividing us politically. Now, I think it's important to understand this because I think this tells us a lot about political possibilities for compromise. Class differences are based on money, material goods, and those are divisible. But values are not divisible. You either are for abortion or you're against it. You're usually not, oh, well, we can have it under some circumstances. Speak slower, yes. This is what my students always say to me. Please speak more slowly, Professor Duquette. Okay, I'll try. The translator can't possibly keep up, I understand. Gender issues are often not divisible. They are often matters of morality, matters of values. They're not easily negotiable. They're not subject easily to being Solomonic decisions, if you want. And therefore, it's a very difficult thing to imagine that the kinds of issues that many women have viewed as absolutely crucial to feminist organizing, including issues of women's choice and issues of gender education and concerns about patriarchy and so forth, these things are easily subject to backlash, polarization, and have become part of the current division on a lot of other issues in US politics and also in Latin American politics. Certainly we could see this in terms of the presidencies of right-wing populists such as President Trump and Bolsonaro, who gained a considerable popular support by being anti-feminist and by rejecting the progressive changes that had happened on those issues in their countries. How these issues are dealt with in the future will determine, it seems to me, a lot about whether women continue to support democracy, how they do so, and under what conditions. And these are not easy issues to resolve. So far, I think there's some very disturbing aspects of this that haven't been noted much in the literature. Most academic work on feminist issues has tended to be very optimistic about progressive change. But it seems to me that if we look at the basis of this, social movements support that progressive change, and social movements, by definition, do not last. They're not sustainable over a long period of time. One of the reasons why backlash can occur, and maybe while we'll go back and forth between various kinds of policies on the issue of abortion, for example. Whoops, 2 minutes, good, I have 2 minutes left to say. But social movements are also very difficult to coordinate with a support of institutions, and I think this is perhaps the most important theoretical issue. Most feminist theory is pretty anti-institutional. There's a book, very famous book, 30 years ago now, but very famous, called The Feminist Case Against Bureaucracy. There's very little sympathy in social movements for institutions, which are thought to be to carry hierarchical organization, to be organized hierarchically, and to be very much supporters of the status quo. So when you're a social movement, you're often attacking institutions rather than building them. So one of the problems that we're talking about a lot in this conference, the lack of democratic institutions, the lack of the rule of law and so forth, are not easily addressed by the history of women's organizing and feminist organizing in the United States or in Latin America, because it's social movement based, not concerned particularly with how to build and create new institutions, only in terms of, in many ways, delegitimizing those institutions. So I think that's an important concern that we have in terms of looking for the future. One final thought. Those who observe and write about these movements and social movements and progressive legislations and change, increased women's political participation, all those good things, we have to stop, I think, and ask, as perhaps many in this group are asking, what are the structural conditions and how are they changing, and how will that affect women's participation in politics, in the labor force? How are their interests going to be affected by the changes that are taking place? What are the requirements of democracy? Do we have to have an effective state? If so, feminism hasn't had a lot to say about that. Do we need well-managed borders? Again, there's not a lot of feminist theory on this topic or women's practice on this topic. How about labor policies that reward work that is now unpaid, but is much less harmful for the environment? Do we need a changed economic model that, instead of emphasizing economic growth, emphasizes services, care work, things that women do but have not been recognized or paid for? Finally, just one point about China. We talk a lot about China representing a new form, an anti-democratic form of government or illiberal form of government. What is, and China's reputation now as a country that's supporting women's rights has gone by the boards. It's no longer the case. So when China comes in with its particular form of autocracy as a model, how will that affect women's claims to democratic representation, to having their interests heard in the political system? I think this is something no one's talking about, but I think it has some scary implications. So I guess I'm trying to say, are we as feminists, but also assuming all of you are feminists at heart, are we all who are concerned with women's issues thinking enough about the broader context and how to use a gender analysis to both develop better policies, but also to recognize that some of the trends we're talking about now are going in directions that might be very harmful to things we've assumed about progressive women's legislation over a long period of time. I think we have to make a much wider arc in our thinking in order to make the connections that we need, and I only hope that we can do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chiquette, for those encouraging words on strides that have been made. So now we will pass the baton over to Guy Mantell. Guy, are you there? Can't hear you, you're on mute.
Oh, can you hear me okay now?
Yes, please proceed.
There we go. Great. So thank you very much, Yvonne, and my apologies that I can't be with you all in person today. But it's an honor to speak here today from freezing cold Washington, D.C., with the Summit of the Americas just a short period away, and of course with distinguished friends and colleagues on the panel here with me. I want to start, like others have, by thanking Funglode and President Fernandez for convening this important event, and also to the wonderful audience here that has stayed throughout these panels and presentations. I will do my very best to keep this relatively short before Yvonne drops the hammer on me in terms of time. But a note of warning also, I'm a bit under the weather, so if my voice starts making weird sounds, don't be alarmed. That's what that is. So today I'm speaking briefly about relations between the United States and the Caribbean with an eye toward new opportunities, new obstacles, and new perspectives. At Global Americans, the think tank I'm proud to direct today, we engage regularly with leaders and change makers in the public and private sector of countries all across our hemisphere. And we work to cultivate a deeper commitment to democracy and development, but also to engage a new generation of leadership cognizant of these opportunities and these obstacles in our hemisphere. And one of the driving impulses of this work is a belief that I think will resonate with folks here today. It's the belief that the US, Latin America, and the US Caribbean policy playbook is in some ways in need of an update, a revamping of sorts that takes into account new modern realities and discards the sort of reflexive reliance on the status quo. So part of my comments here today will be infused with that sort of belief. And so along these lines, as we look to the Summit of the Americas at this inflection point that Yvonne mentioned at the top of his remarks, of turmoil, of epidemiological devastation, of political instability, we ought also consider, in my view, the fact that among the commentariat, and Professor Jacob was just referring to this, there's also been a sort of assumption that the trend lines in our region and indeed our world were generally in our favor, which is similar to what Yale historian Timothy Snyder had called the politics of inevitability, which he meant kind of the misconceived notion that progress was almost inevitable, as if some sort of outside force was going to inexorably push along a cart full of the political change that we desire and wish for. And in Snyder's view, the post-Cold War era led many in foreign policy bubbles to sort of assume that the battle of ideas had been won in favor of capitalism, democracy, and freedom. And I know this will seep in a little bit into Anatoli's comments, but as we look around the world today, and again, as we prepare for the Summit of the Americas in June, whether it's Russia's invasion of Ukraine or democratic backsliding in our hemisphere, I would argue that we ought to be clear-eyed as to the moment that we're in, the inflection point that we're in and the opportunities that are before us because of it. And what the politics of inevitability do, problematically in my view, is they create an impression of some sort of invisible hand bringing about change. So it's whether it's markets, international institutions, and in so doing, we lose the habit of stretching, of looking for warning signs, of innovating, of identifying gaps and filling holes. So I'd like to do a bit of that mental stretching here together, of looking for those gaps, of looking for those holes, and identifying some opportunities and some threats that organizationally we at Global Americans have identified over the past couple of years. And maybe I'll start by kind of doing a 30,000-foot summary of what US engagement with Latin America and the Caribbean has largely looked like over the past few decades, centered on three pillars of engagement, I would argue: economic growth and prosperity, security, and democratic governance. And I think in the United States, particularly under the Trump administration, we've seen a challenging of some longstanding norms in our international engagements. Namely, I think a rethinking of how the US engages with multilateral institutions and the international system more broadly, which under former President Trump was best captured in his America First mantra. I think that current is now running up against another, which is the presidency of Joe Biden, who brings with him deep experience on the international stage, but also a deep understanding of allied nations and the importance of multilateral engagement, which has actually been bolstered by a sort of paradoxical revitalization of the international liberal order in the aftermath of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. So in the context of that moment, as we look at what opportunities exist today, without taking any of the politics of inevitability for granted, I think it's important to ask, where should political and civil society actors focus their efforts to move the guardrails of what is possible and what is feasible? And again, I'd like to touch upon just a few of the things in the short time that I have that Global Americans has looked at organizationally. For one, if one is to look at the winds of change here in Washington, and again, I'm jealous because they're quite cold here today, the Biden administration has shown itself eager and willing to engage in a deeper way on a whole host of issues. I think climate, security, rule of law, and economic revitalization. I think they've shown and they've indicated a deep desire to re-engage the region and the hemisphere and to prove itself a reliable partner, as we've seen on vaccines and pandemic relief. But I also think as we transition beyond the immediate pandemic response and toward a longer-term approach to revitalization and growth, there needs to also be a focus, again, heeding kind of the impacts of the pandemic on enlarging social safety nets and also envisioning a new, perhaps more sustainable status quo. And one of the places where the marriage of obstacles and opportunities hits most pointedly is probably the climate space. The importance of energy and climate dynamics in the hemisphere is almost impossible to overstate, as our friends in the Caribbean know well. Latin America and the Caribbean, we know, is one of the world's most climate vulnerable regions. And the most obvious unraveling that we face in the coming decades is arguably that of the environment. I'm not just talking about in rural areas, but in cities in our hemisphere, up to a quarter of the population has no access to potable water. There are no developed sanitation and sewage systems in many cities functioning alongside skyrocketing pollution. And then again, as we transition away from cities, deforestation and increases in temperatures are also threatening not just the viability of communities, but their ability to produce commodities that drive their country's economies. And so soybeans, fruits, and fisheries are all highly sensitive to climate change and climate variability, as is cattle ranching, as is coffee farming. For all of this, there is a great deal of variance in the region, but we see the same pattern all over the globe. The poor and the marginal, whether urban or rural, suffer much more, both measured from within and among levels of inequality. And stated plainly, again, as we look toward the Summit of the Americas in June, we, and I say the collective we here, are simply not doing enough. And so as we pass beyond tipping points, policymakers must not only tackle the question of how might we curb climate change, but also how we can adjust to new rules and new limits. And so I think that is to say the risk of climate change is not just measured by exposure or water levels, but also by the robustness of institutions to deal with it. And I think here the region with very high urban concentrations and also governance structures that have faced some challenge in recent years may have to deal with even more consequences than most of the organic models might otherwise predict. And so I think we can look at the Paris Climate Accords and we can look at the 2021 UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow as important steps in turbocharging climate engagement. But I posit that countries should use the Summit of the Americas, which has as its mission statement, building a sustainable, resilient, and equitable future, to push for more, to further incentivize private sector investment in renewable energy and natural gas infrastructure, to begin to convene regional energy summits and then prioritize the interrelated issues of energy security and climate change in both bilateral and regional agreements in the Americas. And the US has a leadership role to play here, and particularly the United States Treasury, which I think can help reimagine the Inter-American Development Bank, among other institutions, and push it to become a real player here, a major climate financing mechanism, building on what is right now a limited but already existing green lending program. And to be sure, climate has been one of the biggest, if not the biggest, policy priorities for the new Biden administration. But it's also a prime space, in my view, for international engagement with the Biden administration. And just yesterday, the Biden administration announced billions in new funding for climate, for clean energy, for environmental justice, all as part of its fiscal year 2023 budget, which, if enacted, it now needs to go through the process of getting approval in Congress. But if enacted, the budget would meet President Biden's commitment to quadruple climate finance from peak Obama-era levels. And so outside of the executive in the United States, on Capitol Hill in Congress, recent bills from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, from the House Foreign Affairs Committee, they've all done well to elevate the issues of climate and intra-regional relations, but also appeal to a broader swath of stakeholders through mention of opportunities, that is jobs, innovation, investments, to counter China, which, as we know, is a tried and true argument to encourage engagement on Capitol Hill. But as our work has shown in the Caribbean in particular, the US administration needs to engage Caribbean nations and provide them a platform and an opportunity to work with it to shape the solutions to the climate crisis. And I think the United States should generally be careful about reducing the hemisphere to a sort of arena for great power competition. And though China is viewed with maybe a combination of hope and distrust in Latin America and the Caribbean, I would argue that the US is best served by engaging and working to replicate and broaden programs like the BUILD Act of a few years ago, which provide alternatives to regional dependency on China for development funds. And the US can also engage with the Development Finance Corporation here in the United States and the US Agency for International Development to partner with the IDB and with other development banks throughout the region to really push forth grant funding that would A, build institutional capacity to confront climate change, but B, build institutional capacity for governments to move forward after the pandemic. So I think that is a huge opportunity, but alongside the opportunities, I also want to talk about some obstacles and some threats. Again, Global Americans has worked a lot on the information space, namely being mindful of new threats, whether emanating from climate deniers, foreign state media housed in anti-democratic nations, or troll farms paid to support candidates and causes. And I think one of the most concerning threats that we've seen in recent years has been a startling spread of misleading, inaccurate, or false news through disinformation and misinformation activities, which we've monitored for the past 2 years. And disinformation, like climate change, also transcends borders. It also distorts and polarizes environments, and it also causes significant real-world harm sometimes at the behest of malicious actors and governments seeking to undermine democratic governance, human rights, and public health responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. I think one of the more concerning things that we've seen is that disinformation activities are proliferating now faster and farther on social media and encrypted messaging platforms, whether that's Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, or Telegram. And I think problematically, these platforms have repeatedly prioritized English language content moderation, which means that they failed to invest sufficient resources in addressing equally harmful Spanish language mis and disinformation. And so we saw about a year ago, the Facebook whistleblower, Frances Haugen, testified in the US Congress and noted that something in the neighborhood of 87% of all misinformation spending from Facebook or Meta is spent on English language content, which leaves only a small fraction of Facebook spending on Spanish language content, despite the fact that only a small fraction of Facebook's users are English speakers. So I think it would be wise, again, with an eye toward the Summit of the Americas, for governments to use the summit to make a clear call to curbing the threat, to convening experts and stakeholders, and to sharing knowledge and best practices developed in coordination with partners to strengthen vulnerable information environments, all, of course, while maintaining respect for internationally recognized rights of freedom of expression. And if I can, I want to quickly summarize, and I know I'm running short on time here, quickly summarize the substantive thrusts that we found of disinformation campaigns, and therefore maybe to underscore the threats that they pose. From our research, these campaigns are often concerted efforts to sow skepticism and distrust in institutions in a way that plays on divisiveness and anger. So one of the essential findings of our work is actually that the engines of mis and disinformation, rather than creating social dysfunction out of nothing, are in fact reflecting and amplifying pre-existing social fault lines. And for us, that's where disinformation's big impact on public policy, both domestically and internationally, lies. In closing here, as we've heard, I think over the past 24 hours or so of keynotes and presentations, there are a lot of issues to be lifted up during the Summit of the Americas. I think strengthening democratic institutions, increasing government transparency, security, trade, climate, infrastructure development, and then of course, pandemic relief and recovery. I would just add that a number of the challenges facing our region are rooted in the need to institutionalize and solidify state capacity, to minimize economic inequality, and to broaden access to political institutions. And I think many states in our hemisphere we know have been weakened by the pandemic in a very serious way. No other region in the world suffered a bigger economic contraction from the pandemic than Latin America. But I would argue that economic inequality is a sort of self-reinforcing phenomenon, such that countries become more unequal. As they become more unequal, the political institutions they develop and the relative strength of political actors risk making economic inequality all the more durable. So I think as such, one of the main challenges that the region will face in terms of inequality, again, with an eye toward the summit, is tied to state capacity to keep access to political and economic institutions broad and open, and to allow for social mobility and the ability for the underprivileged to actually influence political and economic outcomes. And so I think summits like these, conferences like these, allow for the beginning of a reimagining at this key inflection point. I think they allow us to reevaluate the politics of inevitability, to rethink the status quo, particularly at a moment like this with challenges to the international order on the one hand, and the need to rebuild and recover after a catastrophic pandemic on the other. So it's an honor to be part of that conversation with you all here, but to also share the virtual stage with my panelists. So I look forward to your questions and then to hopefully being there in person next time. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Guy, for those remarks. And we finally turn to Anatoly. I appreciate your patience, Anatoly, and we look forward to hearing your comments. Thank you. Is he there?
Hi, I'm sorry, I was in mute. Thank you, Ivan. Thank you, President Fernandez. I'll keep it short. I believe we're living through truly transformative events whose aftershocks we're still beginning to comprehend. I think the fact that we're seeing conventional warfare in Europe in 2022, the fact that we're seeing one of the world's major powers becoming an isolated pariah will have all sorts of major consequences on the world order and how countries interact with each other. And this does not exclude Latin America, despite being far from the actual fighting. As a Russian, it's hard for me to kind of overestimate the shock of seeing Russian bombs fall on Ukraine. You know, it's given them historical, cultural ties. Pretty much everyone in Russia has family, friends that live in Ukraine. And so something that was unthinkable just a month ago, truly unthinkable to a lot of people in Europe, has become reality. And we are now sort of just beginning to see, I think, the first outlines of the consequences of it. I think we can separate the effects of a war in Latin America into economic and geopolitical. In terms of economic effects, we are already seeing higher fuel and food prices that have resulted from the fighting. This, of course, feeds into an even higher inflation in a region that has seen already very big increases in the cost of living. Obviously, this has major political effects. There's already been very strong discontent in Latin America with the status quo, with the elites, with traditional political systems, the way pandemic was handled, and the high inflation, rising cost of living, I think has already become a major political theme in the current electoral cycles. We've seen for the last few years already a trend of incumbents being voted out of power, of traditional parties being punished. Peru, Chile are just the latest examples, and in elections that are coming up, it's the outsiders or candidates that present themselves as outsiders that are leading. Petro in Colombia, former World Bank economist who's kind of presenting himself as kind of populist, anti-system, crusader Rodrigo Chavez in Costa Rica. And I think we can just see acceleration of a trend of disruption of traditional politics as the economic impacts of a war feeds through. Obviously, they could be further down the line if Latin American countries can sort of stabilize their imports of raw materials in terms of exports of commodities that are up. So we could see a scenario where some countries that are net exports of agricultural or metals like Brazil or Chile could benefit, while countries that are very heavily reliant on imports of food and fuel, which is primarily Central America and Caribbean, I think could see a lot more economic and political disruption. In terms of geopolitical effects, I think we will see a reshuffle in the balance of power in the region. I think when this fighting began, there was some initial analysis that Russia may try to, in a way, expand its standoff with the US by putting pressure on the US through its proxies in Latin America, which its main allies, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela primarily. So far, we have not seen this happening to any meaningful extent. And the fact is that Russia today is a much weaker state than it was a month ago, with much less resources and means to project its influence. And I think alliances are not really about ideology. That's kind of a political rhetoric used to disguise them. It's about conversion of interest. And I think every leader in Latin America right now, especially the authoritarian countries that I mentioned, I'm thinking, how does this affect me? How does this benefit me? What cost does it have for me? And I was, as a kind of long-term observer of Latin America's relations with Russia, I was relatively surprised by the reaction taken by Russia's allies towards the fighting. We've seen, very strong and equivocal, supports for Putin from the governments of Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela up until the start of the fighting. The day the fighting began, you've seen definitely a change of rhetoric because, as I said, I think even these countries are trying to evaluate, how does this benefit me? What does this mean for me? And then the fact is there's very little immediate benefit for these governments to be had. Let's take the example of Venezuela, perhaps the most egregious example of Russia's presence in Latin America. Russia, of course, was key in Russia's economic, logistical, diplomatic, technical support, was key in allowing Maduro to remain in power in 2019, when opposition leader Guaido proclaimed as a president and the US, rolled out these really unprecedented at the time sanctions against Venezuelan governments. Over these last several years, Venezuela had become extremely reliant on Russia to continue exporting its oil, to buy and sell goods from abroad through Russia's financial system, to service its military through Russian technical supports, etc. And the fact is that the sanctions have made all of this much more complicated. The Venezuelan government now lost access to the Russian financial system. The supply chains that are built through Russia to avoid American sanctions have become disrupted. And we now facing a scenario where Russian sanctioned oil could be competing for the same markets where Maduro government has been trying to sell its oil, basically China. And so in a way, just in a matter of weeks, Russia has in some ways, in some aspects of economic activity, has changed from being Maduro's ally to being a competitor. And I think that has a lot of consequences. We already seen the US trying to take advantage of this geopolitical turmoil to try to advance its interests, to try to break some of the diplomatic deadlocks in the region inherited from previous administrations. Of course, that was in just a few weeks ago, the high-level U.S. official traveled to Caracas to meet with Maduro. We've seen, release of hostages, negotiations over restarting Venezuelan oil exports to the U.S. Whether it may happen or not, we don't really know. There's a lot of, domestic political obstacles facing the Biden administration. But the fact is, I think it's just an example of this kind of reshuffling, rejiggling, our bilateral relations being put in a mixer, and we still don't really know what's going to come out of it. I think we can expect the U.S. to continue taking advantage of the current geopolitical uncertainty, whether this takes the form of more investments through multilaterals, more diplomatic outreach, etc. We don't know yet, but Summit of Americas is coming up, which I think is much more topical, much more relevant this year than it has been for a while. The wild card, of course, is China. It's still not really clear how China will react and what position it will take in this armed conflict. So far, it has been quite cautious, offering some sort of rhetorical support for Russia, but not stepping too closely into its alliance, not providing any meaningful financial or military support for it. And I think, as another major superpower, it's only logical to expect it to take advantage of the turmoil to expand its interests in Latin America as well. You know, whether it means, you know, an alliance with weaker Russia to solidify its position in Russia's former allies, or some other form, which we just don't know. But the planks that sort of supported how nations interact with each other through these three main powers is shaken, perhaps terminally, perhaps forever. So what's going to come out after it is yet to be seen. But I do think we should not underestimate just how transcendental these months are for, you know, the way I think the world will be. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we've been very fortunate this afternoon to hear different perspectives, the role of Canada in foreign policy. Unfortunately, Canada is sometimes overshadowed by its neighbor to the south in relation to its hemispheric policy. Then the role of women in development and progress in the region, or lack thereof. Then to hear US policy in the Caribbean, which is sometimes an afterthought in US relations toward the region. And lastly, this very timely subject on the situation in Ukraine and how it relates to Latin America. So unfortunately, I'm told, so I'm sorry to disappoint Danielle, that we can't have questions and answers. We're running behind time. As you see, I'm a marshmallow in terms of following time as I thought I could. But I thank all of you, those here in person and those that participated virtually. Thank you all, and we look forward to a next session. Thank you.